Open up this meeting tonight. We'll start off the meeting with a lead off on the topic of nuclear power and the need for renewables. Dave, our youngest member of the branch, will lead off on this topic, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions and discussions from the floor. So,
do you want to close the door?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Yes, no.
And I'll hand it over to Dave while I'm closing the door.
All right, obviously we've come along tonight to discuss the issue of the environment and nuclear power. And that's in the aftermath really of the events that have gone on in Japan. On the 11th of March, Japan was hit by one of the most powerful earthquakes that has occurred there in the last 110 years. Following that earthquake, it was then swamped by a massive tsunami that reached heights of up to nearly 40 metres in some areas, according to research by the University of Tokyo. This catastrophic event has devastated entire areas of Japan and has left hundreds of thousands of people homeless, without proper access to shelter and to basic things such as food. And this is going on in absolutely freezing conditions, which in and of itself poses a further threat to the lives and health of these people. So far there have been over 12,000 people confirmed dead, and there are a further over 15,000 that are still missing. And you know, as if the devastation that was wrought by these earthquakes and by the tsunami wasn't bad enough, you then added to this crisis, added to the mix, the problem of the nuclear disaster which has occurred at the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. Damage suffered to the plant during the earthquake and the tsunami that followed has resulted in a partial meltdown of the nuclear reactors there, and the leaking and spewing of radioactive material into the environment. These events such as earthquakes and tsunamis do occur in Japan, and are supposedly accounted for in the planning for these events. These power stations are supposedly built to withstand these attacks. However, you know, in this case that was blatantly not done, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. But you know, just to give you a bit of an idea of the amount, I think it's been downplayed a lot in the media, or in some reports anyway, the amount of radioactive material that's been spewed out into the environment. But the oceans, measures of radioactive levels in the oceans just outside the plant have recorded levels of radioactivity 4,000 times the legal limit in Japan. And there has been material spewing into the air which has reached down as far as Tokyo, and has contaminated large areas in Japan, including contaminated food sources, which will then have further complications down the track. There have also already been a number of workers that have died heroically attempting to avert a complete catastrophe. And the attitude, you know, I think it's revealing the attitude of TEPCO, which is Tokyo Electric Power Company. This is the company that owns the plant and is responsible for the power plant, the nuclear power plant that has had this crisis. You know, when talking in relation to to reporters posing, you know, the fact that the actions of the workers and of the community have been heroic in trying to avert a nuclear catastrophe, you know, they simply turned around and said that no, you know, these are not heroic actions. This is just what's required. I think it'd be interesting to know if any of the senior directors of the company had actually been involved in the rescue effort. And I think the answer to that you would find is no, they haven't. And it's gone even further than this. In fact, one farmer whose property is 65 kilometres away from the nuclear power station has actually just recently committed suicide. The reason he did this was because he was told that he was not allowed to sell his crops and that he was going to get no compensation for this, and so in an act of desperation he took his own life. And just to give you a bit of an idea about that, this is 65 kilometres. The evacuation zone set up by the Chinese government was initially just 12. Japanese government was initially just 12 kilometres, extended out to 20 kilometres later on. in the face of evidence. You know, this has been shown to be completely inadequate, as properties as far as 65 kilometres away are now being affected by this crisis. It is already clear that it is going to be ordinary people that will pay the price for this catastrophe, not the profit-hungry owners of TEPCO or their pro-big business partners in government, who have supported and who have supported and grown the nuclear industry for years and years, and are now attempting to place the blame for this on anyone but themselves. And I think it's interesting just to look at briefly at a little bit of the history of the nuclear industry in Japan. A lot of it was initially established to end Japan's reliance on oil and other imported energy sources. 99% of Japan's oil usage is imported, and after the major oil crises and oil price spikes that occurred in the 70s, there was a big move in Japan away from reliance on coal and oil and onto nuclear technology. At the same time, they've attempted to challenge the power of the unions in these industries by initially splitting up the company, privatising the state-owned company, which has now led to the private ownership of TEPCO and all of the cost-cutting exercises that have come as a result of that. And I think this crisis has again raised the debate over nuclear power, and you know, again raised the question that is nuclear power safe? Is it a safe alternative to fossil fuels? And you know, I suppose this question is given added weight by the global climate crisis going on at the moment, and governments looking for an answer to that problem. And while nuclear power might have the accidental quality that it doesn't produce carbon emissions, I think it's pretty clear from the evidence that nuclear power is simply not a safe option. You know, there are no shortage of experts, nuclear experts around the world that can tell you that nuclear power is now a safe option, and that previous disasters such as those at 3 Mile Island and the Chernobyl accident were just due to either a combination of old technology or bad planning and bad techniques. But I think that, you know, if you take a balance sheet of the history of the nuclear industry, it is time and time again been claimed that we now have safe technology, that we now can produce nuclear energy in a safe way, and time again we've had these accidents. And even if it were relatively safe to produce nuclear power nowadays, at the actual power plants themselves to avert a meltdown, which I think is very, very questionable, you know, it still does not make nuclear power a safe option. You still have the dangers involved for workers in the local communities where uranium is mined. If you look at the Olympic Dam uranium mine here in Australia, you see that the workers there are exposed to high levels of radiation, even with the regulations that are in place, and that there are increased numbers of complications with their families as a result of that. That plays out in increased numbers of cancer and other illnesses associated with radiation poisoning. There's dangers in the transportation of these nuclear materials once they're dug up, and then they then need to be transferred to somewhere to be enriched and then used for nuclear power. There is a threat from meltdowns that still does remain, however safe they say these things are. You know, this has again been highlighted by the crisis in Japan. And there is, you know, and I suppose probably the most important thing I think to keep in mind in relation to nuclear power is the fact that there is still no solution as to what to do with the wasted fuel. Once the fuel has been spent and the reactor is no longer used, there is still no viable solution as to what to do with these things. These sources of radioactivity can remain active for tens of thousands of years. And there is still no site in the earth that has been agreed upon where we can put them. And there's still no solution as to what to do with that. I mean, if you see what's happened at the Fukushima plant, their response to having nowhere to dump it has just been to store the spent fuel rods on site, which again has raised further complications, as these spent fuel rods are now a massive source of worry in that the water that was cooling them has been sloshed out, and that these spent fuel rods have experienced partial meltdowns as well, and pose a threat and pose a serious threat to the environment. I think the other point to make as well is the fact that nuclear power is just not required. You know, at the moment, we produce most of our electricity here in Australia and around the world from non-renewable sources, from fossil fuels such as coal and oil. But the plain fact is that we could produce all of our energy needs here in Australia and around the world from renewable sources. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, I think now, where they were talking about renewable energy, and there was a bar chat which I just thought was quite good in just demonstrating how much energy is available from renewable sources. And it basically had a chart that said, this is how much energy we use in Western Australia at the moment. This is how much is available from solar. This is how much is available from wind. This is how much is available from geothermal. And I suppose the reason I raise that is just because it demonstrates to you that there is an abundant available resources of renewable energy sources. And it's just about, the question is, nuclear is just completely not required. The question is not, are these resources available and do we have the technology to utilise these sources? The question is there the political will to actually utilise these sources and move from fossil fuels over to renewable energy? And the threat from nuclear power generation is further compounded by the profit system, by the system that puts returns to shareholders and profits ahead of the safety of workers and ahead of the needs of society. TEPCO has now got its third successive president to oversee a nuclear so-called accident, and this is a trend that's set to continue if there is no challenge to what has been termed by the Liberal Democratic Party, the opposition party in Japan, as the unholy triangle between TEPCO, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, and the regulator that's meant to oversee the industry. And just to give you sort of a bit of an example of this unholy triangle, is this guy Toru Ishida, who used to be an energy official with METI. As soon as he left that role, he moved straight into a senior advisor position at TEPCO. It just and there are regular questions raised by many people in Japan over the integrity of the regulator and over the government's blind support for nuclear power. TEPCO has been criticised for providing inconsistent and inaccurate information. The response to the crisis has also been criticised. With officials trying to lay the blame on TEPCO and I suppose absolve themselves from any blame. Of